no. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them. Never. Never. That was the training that I had.
Okay, well, Alec Baldwin, as you saw there, insisted that he did not pull the trigger in that fatal shooting of cinematographer Helena Hutchins on that set of the movie Rust in New Mexico last year. But according to a new report by the FBI that was obtained by ABC News over the weekend, the gun delivering the fatal bullet, quote, could not be made to fire without a pull of the trigger. Meanwhile, yesterday, the Hutchins killing was ruled an accident by New Mexico's Office of the Medical Investigator. Baldwin maintains that the gun was faulty and fired on its own and has not been charged with the crime in the shooting. Joining us now is firearms safety trainer and former police sergeant and SWAT team member and owner of T4 Tactics, Marco Galbraith. Marco, welcome back to the show. We just got brand new sound of Alec Baldwin explaining what happened on set. I want to play that for you first. Take a listen.
You're familiar with what fanning a gun is. Have you heard of that phrase, fanning a gun?
Yes, but explain.
So if you pull the hammer back and you don't lock the hammer, if you pull the hammer back pretty far, in old Western movies, you'd see someone fan the hammer of the gun. The hammer didn't lock. You pulled it back to an extent where it would fire the bullet without you pulling the trigger, without you locking the hammer.
All right, Marco, that's interesting because that's a new version of what happened that he's telling Chris Cuomo there on his podcast. The interesting thing is, explain to people on a revolver, if you pull back the hammer, right, the hammer of the gun, you pull it back, is that not the same as pulling the trigger of the gun?
If you pull the hammer back, it's got certain locking mechanisms that when you pull it back this far, it locks, pull it back this far, it locks. But if you pull that trigger, that releases those locking mechanisms and it's going to fire. Most handguns, most firearms, the only way it's going to fire is if you pull the trigger. I don't know if this gun was manipulated by a gunsmith, for Hollywood production, but if you pull the trigger, that's how a gun fires. The gun that he had is not going to fire unless you pull the trigger.
Does it matter that it was an antique gun and maybe didn't have the same safety mechanisms that a modern day gun has?
No, those antique guns have those locking mechanisms where you pull it back slightly, it locks. Pull it back slightly. So if I pull it back just less than halfway, a quarter, and I accidentally let it go, it's going to stop. It's going to lock. It's not going to go forward. I have to pull the trigger in order to get it to fire.
So let's get to the nut of this FBI forensics report, right? It came out yesterday, and it basically says that it says very clearly, could not be made to fire without a pull of the trigger while working the internal components were intact and functional. Is that not what you're basically saying the same thing, right? Which is unless Baldwin pulled the trigger, there's no way that gun could have gone off. Is that correct?
Yeah, you'd have to have your finger on the trigger, and from my understanding, and from what the FBI is saying, you'd have to have your finger on the trigger when you pull that hammer back, and then you're going to release that hammer to fall on that primer, which is going to cause the gun to discharge. And I'd like to look at prior movies that he's been in and see what his, the footage from when they're training and practicing. Has he been taught to keep that finger off the trigger? Police are taught to keep the finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. But Hollywood is taught, put your finger on the trigger. And I'm a stickler for detail, and I watch movies, and I see a lot of movie actors with their finger on the trigger. So has he been trained? He may not remember that he pulled the trigger or had his finger on the trigger. If he wasn't properly trained, he doesn't know that gun's going to fire if you depress that trigger.
Well, and that's the thing, that yesterday the report came out in New Mexico that said that it was ruled an accident. There's no one, I think, who's not agreeing that this was an accident. It wasn't like anyone's saying that Baldwin intentionally did this, but he's adamant. That his lawyer is saying that the FBI report was misconstrued and the gun fired, testing only one time without having to pull the trigger when the hammer was pulled back and the gun broke into two different places, right? So I'm trying to figure out why he's so defiant, because to your point, it's not like anyone's accusing him of trying to intentionally kill this woman. He could honestly have said it was a mistake. I wasn't trained properly, whatever. And I don't think anyone would have found that he was guilty of murder. But he's adamant that somehow it's not his fault. And yet the FBI and all the forensics are like, yes, that is what happened.
when we have traumatic things happen to us, we don't remember the details. He may not remember. He honestly may not remember that he had his finger on the trigger or that he pulled the trigger. He may not have been trained properly. But finger on the trigger is what we teach in firearm safety. If your finger's on the trigger, that gun is able to be fired. And that's probably, I would imagine that's what happened. He may not remember it, or he's had time to meet with his attorneys. So there's a lot of different things that we need to look at here. But I would imagine he pulled the trigger. And I would imagine the FBI really inspected that gun to make sure that you have to depress the trigger in order for that gun that he was using to fire.
It's amazing how he's gotten off the hook on this. Anyway, Marco, I appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.